Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today we're talking Tetris. Tetris, if you're unfamiliar with it, I don't know how that could possibly be, but if you are unfamiliar with it, is a blocky 8-bit video game, originally made for computers, quickly ported to the 8-bit Nintendo, the Commodore 64, other home computers, and the Nintendo Game Boy. And then subsequently ported to every electronic device with a screen that has ever existed since then. Tetris, more or less, took the world by storm, and is to this day one of the best-selling standalone video games of all time. It has been re-released and reissued and remixed and remastered and modified and etc., etc., etc. so many times that there's literally countless iterations of Tetris. Too many to list. The Wikipedia page is a fucking mile long and probably unreliable. But where did it come from? Well, we know it came from some dude in Russia. We know that part of the story. But how did it get into our lives? Well, I've already talked about the complicated situation with Atari and Nintendo fighting over the rights of Tetris in a previous video. You can go back and watch that video if you want a little more in-depth. But the short version is Atari had the arcade rights and Nintendo had the console rights. There was some confusion. Atari tried to put it on the NES. Nintendo stopped them. And then Nintendo found out, hey, we can put this on the Game Boy, which they did when they launched the Game Boy in 1989. And every human being on the face of the earth bought a Game Boy with Tetris in 1990. And maybe that's hyperbole, but I mean, might as well have been. And as far as that story goes, the rest is history. Tetris became a phenomenal force to be reckoned with. And to this day, Nintendo continues to be basically the only game in town when it comes to portable handheld gaming. At least on dedicated gaming hardware. Obviously, there's casual mobile games, but that's a separate topic. But anyways, alright. So, the early days, my first experience with Tetris was actually going to a video arcade and playing the Atari arcade Tetris game. And it was really cool. And I was like, this looks fun. There weren't a lot of puzzle games in arcades at that time. At that time, the arcade industry had shifted. There were a lot of side-scrolling beat-em-ups, and we were just getting ready to enter our one-on-one fighting game phase. We were just in between the beat-em-up phase and the fighting game phase. So Tetris came on the scene at the right time. I remember being enamored, and then I was at the video rental store, and they had Tetris for the NES, and we had an NES in our house. So I remember renting Tetris, taking it home, and initially being disappointed, as is to be expected. It was nothing like the arcade game. But also knowing that that's the norm, I didn't connect the dots and realize that this was a different version of Tetris. Had I rented the Tengen Tetris, I would have got the arcade version, but that's another story. Now, here's where it gets a little complicated. We moved. And we moved to another town. And I went to another video store. And they had Tetris for the NES. But it was in a different box. And instead of the standard gray cartridge with a sticker on front, it was a curved black cartridge that said Tengen. I had seen before because I believe Paperboy, RBI Baseball, and a couple other games I had played over the years came in that style of cartridge. And so I was vaguely familiar with, oh, Tengen. I didn't realize that it was an unofficial, unlicensed game. I didn't know that back in the day. So I took it home expecting to play the version of Tetris I had previously played on the NES. And all of a sudden I was playing the arcade game that I remembered from back before. And I was like, wait, there's two versions of Tetris, completely different versions of Tetris on the NES? I was a little confused. In 1997, we have to fast forward a little bit, I ended up getting a Super Game Boy for my Super Nintendo. Not a proper Game Boy handheld, a Super Game Boy cartridge that you plug into the SNES and it lets you play Game Boy games on your TV. And the very first game my dad gave me when I got the Super Game Boy was Tetris. Now, I told the story about how I bought a Wii and then my parents confiscated it from me and took it and made it their Wii, and I never got to play the machine that was mine that I paid money for. Same thing happened with the Super Game Boy. My parents realized that it played Tetris, and my mom basically loved Tetris to the point where they hijacked my Super Nintendo. And so I was more or less relegated to sitting in my room playing Sega while my mom played my Super Nintendo because she wanted to play Tetris, which was kind of frustrating. Eventually, I got my mom her own handheld, dedicated Tetris game, and she gave me my Super Nintendo back, because I had to do what I had to do. I wasn't interested in playing Tetris. I was interested in playing Super Mario World and Killer Instinct, and Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, etc. But hey, what are you going to do? You got to work within the parameters of the rules the adults make. And so that's what I did. I adapted. But I also discovered very quickly, once again, Game Boy Tetris was a completely different game than the previous two versions I had already experienced. 2.5 versions, counting the arcade version, and the Tengen version is technically the same game, but also kind of sort of different. But anyways, so I was like, alright, what's going on? Around this time, I also got a game called Tetris Dr. Mario for the SNES. Also was not a big fan of, but that's another one that my mom hijacked. And I ended up getting, in 2000, September, for my 18th birthday, I ended up buying a Nintendo 64 and a Sony PlayStation the very same day. Told this story a bajillion times. Mere months after getting my PlayStation, I was collecting games for both. There were not a ton of games to collect for the N64 because of the lack of third-party support and the excruciatingly painful software droughts and the flooding of the market with racing games and wrestling games and a bunch of rubbish I wasn't interested in. So I was focusing on buying PlayStation games to satiate my gamer itch at the time. One of the games I came across was on the PlayStation called Tetris Plus. Same story. Mom discovered the game, asked me if she could play it, and I lost access to my PlayStation for a good couple of weeks until she grew tired of it and decided that she preferred the regular Tetris better. No animosity towards my mom. It was just what it is. It is what it is. It was just what happened. I actually, of all the versions of Tetris I had played up to that point, I like the PlayStation Tetris Plus the most. Basic Tetris is fun, fine, classic, whatever. But after a while, it's pretty fucking boring. It gets really fucking repetitive. Over the years, I've had other iterations of Tetris. Tetris Worlds. I had Hatris or Wetris or whatever the fuck it was on the N64. Tetris, I think it was New Tetris or New World Tetris or something like that on the GameCube. Something like that. I had Tetris DS on the Nintendo DS. I had a version of Tetris on the PS3. I have a version Not even sure which version it is. On the PS4. Just Tetris everywhere. At one point in time, when I was building a physical video game library collection, I did have every single cartridge version of Tetris on the Game Boy family. So I had all the Game Boy Tetris games, the Game Boy Color Tetris games, and the Game Boy Advance Tetris games. I had every single one of them. They're all basically the same fucking game. There's no reason to own more than one version of Tetris. It's like Miss Pac-Man. You buy it for whichever video game console is your primary game console, and then the other older versions you have on older consoles you forget about. Because who's not going to be spending time playing Miss Pac-Man? Come on. It's probably the greatest video game ever made. Of course you're making time for Miss Pac-Man. Why wouldn't you? Anyways, all things considered, I give Tetris its due. Obviously, we wouldn't have a Nintendo Switch to this day if Tetris hadn't been a success on the Game Boy back in the day. That is a near undeniable fact. It's basically a straight through line from A to B. So Tetris is absolutely significant historically and culturally important to gaming culture as a whole, as well as to Nintendo gamers and everybody else. Now, not every game console that has a version of Tetris has been a success, but every game console that does not have a version of Tetris has been a failure. So, make of that what you will. Beyond that, I don't really know what else to say. It's Tetris. You've played it at least 10,000 hours. I played it at least 10,000 hours. We all have. Stay cool.